Selamat malam, selamat pagi, selamat sore. It's a bit difficult to find the correct greeting for the time of day across all the time zones our session traverses today: Germany, Italy, Australia, and Indonesia. Welcome to Lontar's LitFest panel on translating Indonesia. I read recently in an article on translation by an Indonesian academic, Novita Dewi. Actually, it was an analysis of John McGlynn's translation of Pramudia Nantatur's Inem, in which she referred to an 18th century French translator, Charles Batteux, who said a translator is master of nothing. He must bend with infinite suppleness to all the variations he finds in his author. But then Batteux went on to clarify, the translator is in possession of everything: art, genius, and diplomacy. It's all a tall order, indeed, to be a translator. There's always the need to find a balance between staying faithful to the original work and creating a unique work of art in the target language that's totally accessible to the foreign reader. Translators have been instrumental in introducing Indonesian language and culture to the world's readers from colonial times right up to the present. Our panel will discuss their experience working as translators of Indonesian literature. How did they first come across Indonesian literature? What are the fundamental issues and challenges of translating literary works into foreign languages? How do they introduce the unique nature of Indonesian language and culture to foreign readers? And what's the potential for Indonesian literature on the world stage? In a moment, we'll hear some of the answers to these questions from the panel. I'm Tony Pollard, the moderator for today's panel, based in Sydney, Australia. After a lifetime career as a teacher of Indonesian and lecturer, I took up literary translating on retirement 15 years ago. Among the authors I've translated are N. Dini, Hannah Rambe, Gustav Sakai, and Mona Silviana for Lontar, and countless short story writers for the Ubud Writers Festival Emerging Writers Annual Bilingual Anthology. I'm co-founder of and moderator of Sydney's Indo Lit Club, a monthly discussion group on Indonesian literature and culture, currently being held on Zoom and now in its third year. So to introduce the panel, we have Antonia Sorrente. She's a lecturer in Indonesian language and literature at the Orientale University in Naples, Italy, and literary translator. Her PhD research focused on the languages of the Punan and Kenyah dialects of Kalimantan. She's translated a number of literary works into Italian. And we have my old mate, Harry Aveling, a long-term translator and researcher of Indonesian literature since the late 1960s, now an emeritus professor at Monash University. He's translated numerous Indonesian works into English, including works by Pramudia Nantatur, Arifin C. Nur, and Iwan Simattumpang, Dewi Lestari, and a long list of others. Sabine Müller is a translator who resides in Cologne in Germany, and she's translated a number of Indonesian literary works into German, including Gunawan Muhammad's collection of poetry Don Quixote and Leila Khudori's novel Pulang Home. So to start, how did you all first become interested in the Indonesian language and translating, and what made you first fall in love with Indonesia and its literature? Starting with you, Sabine.
Thank you, Tony, for introducing me, and thank you to Jakarta for inviting us and to have the opportunity to be here. Actually, it was a longer trip to Asia in 1990 when I traveled through Asia and also through Indonesia, and I just found it such an amazing country with such a diverse culture, complex history, and found it very interesting. And I wanted to study cultural anthropology and thought it would be a good match to study a language too. And fortunately in Cologne there was the department cultural anthropology and another one, Malayology, which was basically Indonesian language and culture and literature too. and these were my two majors at university. And somehow cultural anthropology drifted to the back, and Malayology, Indonesian language and literature, became my major. And so I fell in love with Indonesian literature, and yeah, and love to deal with it.
And your first translations, when were they and what were they? Mm-hmm.
I lived in Bandung and in Jakarta and worked there, among others, for the Goethe Institute. And there I dealt a lot with translations. And I started actually with translating theatre plays. And so there were a couple of stagings in Germany too, but they were my first translations. And then the first novel was Leila Khudori's Pulang.
Right. And Harry, what about your the way you started with Indonesian language and translating?
I started at the University of Sydney in 1960 and continued. I didn't start translating until the beginning of the 1970s, but I did it for a number of reasons. One was that there weren't a lot of translations available, and most of them were not sympathetic to Indonesia. They're particularly anti-Sukarno, subsidized by the CIA, Congress for Cultural Freedom. I actually translated Pemuda because I wanted to react against this political right-wing view of Indonesia. I also translated Iwan Simatupang because I wanted to present a different sort of literature, a sort of writing that's not available in the West. And I did contemporary Indonesian poetry because I liked it. So lots of reasons. I liked it. It was politically important. It was new. It was different. Yeah, thank you.
And Antonia?
Hi, thank you for this very nice possibility of meeting you and also contributing to a bit of what I do and what we do in Italy. How I started. I enrolled in the university where I'm now a lecturer, and I was studying Indonesian language and literature. I had never been to Indonesia before, and I knew nothing when I started. So it was really part of my academic background, and I realized the real importance of literature when then I moved to Indonesia. I've lived in Indonesia for 20 years, and I keep going, of course, on and on. During that time, when I was actually studying in the linguistics program, I realized that actually literature was much more interesting, creative, and could trigger your creativity. So I did learn much better about Indonesian literature when I was in Indonesia, of course, because I was attending book launches, because I was meeting poets and writers. And so that was actually the reason why I then decided to start translating. Of course, we translate all the time when we try to transfer from a language to another. And this is what I also do when I do my research on the Kenya and Puna languages. As you said, I do work on minority languages, and I provide then translation from these minority languages in Indonesian and then in English. So it's already a kind of translation work. But going back to literature, which is actually the topic of our conversation today, when I came back from Indonesia in 2010, at the end of 2009, when I took actually the position of becoming a lecturer of Indonesian, I realized actually that the possibility of a an Italian to have access to Indonesian literature was very close to zero. At that time, the only work that had been translated in Italian were actually 2 or 3. So there were the two Bumi Manusia and Anak Semua Bangsa from Pramudia, translated from English into Italian, and an earlier work from Mokhtar Lubis, translated by my professor of Indonesian. So really, the amount of material that was available was really very little. There have been other kind of publications, I mean, but kind of anthology, so bits and pieces of other work. So at that point, I decided that I should try to contribute. And from that time on, I started translating. So my first translation, full translation, was actually Ayu Tami Saman. And also I translated a couple of poems from Gunawan Muhammad, published in a small journal interested in poems, in poetry. So this was the beginning. After that, then I decided to pick other works of translation. So this is how everything started. I think it's very important for us as an educator of a language and a culture, provide possibilities of reading. And this is not only for my students, but also to, I don't want to say educate, to give a general reader in Italy to have access to other literature. How we translator are able to do that, I don't think actually is our task. I think this is there's a world outside us, which is the publishing world, which actually should take care of what our small efforts can provide. But yeah, this was the beginning. I mean, I studied Indonesian language and literature, and then I went to Indonesia, and I really got in touch with the world of literature.
So, do each of you choose your own projects for translation? Have you had that autonomy, or is it up to the institutions that you work for? And how difficult is it to find publishers for your work? We'll start with you, Harry.
I choose my own, and I choose things that I like. That's very important. Usually when the publishers choose something, sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's very good in Indonesian, but it's not so good in English. And that's an important consideration, that a work in literature goes into a new culture, a new literary way of understanding things. And so I like to feel, as a bicultural translator, that I'm sensitive to the needs of both sides. Is there more?
Right. Sorry?
Is there more? Should I say more?
And Sabine, what about you?
It's a kind of a mix. Sometimes a publisher approaches me and asks me, you know, you have capacities for translation, but this is a rare situation. And mostly I read a book and find it very interesting or worth translating it. And here I find networking is very important. So the networking between other translators, not only from the Indonesian, but also other translators from other languages, and publishers. And so I sometimes make a short expose with a translation sample, something about the author, the cultural, historical background, and yeah, and I try to sell the book to the publisher, and yeah, and then most of the times you have to find the funding for it, or yeah, it's always yeah, kind of adventure. Yeah. But it's not an easy thing to do.
These are small publishers, not mainstream publishers that are willing to take on something like a book in German from Indonesian.
Yeah, this is a curious thing in Germany. I don't know where it is in Italy or in Australia, but it seems that especially the small independent publishers are the curious ones and the most courageous ones who dare to publish Indonesian literature.
Right, and Antonia?
Yeah, well, more or less the same things that have been already said. I generally do choose the things that I translate, just because basically these are the things that interest me much more at the time. I remember the first publication, Saman. I had already translated bits and pieces of Saman in a literary journal that was actually managed by a friend of mine in Italy. But in 2009, I think I was still in Indonesia, but I remember I was approached by a small independent publisher called Metropoli d'Asia, and Metropoli of Asia. And actually he was asking me whether I had anything interesting to propose about Indonesia. And of course I was I'd been already involved in the translation of Saman, and I thought it was a good choice for them. And that actually at that point, really, we tried to match our needs, but I had already been working on that. Well, for Italy, really, the count of work translated in Indonesia can be said in the number of probably 15, and a third of them, maybe more than that, of these 15, maybe I've translated 5 or 6. So imagine there's not really much to talk about, but still I can say that when I choose based on my own interest. So the other work that I translated were Oka Rusmini, Tarian Bumi, the Dance of the Earth. I don't remember the title in English. And then I translated Pulang by Leila Hudori. And finally, the last work that I translated is Febi Indirani, is a very young author whose collection of stories seemed to me very interesting. What is interesting for me is, of course, the possibility of giving few faces of the multifaceted Indonesia. And so, well, I decided Saman for obvious reason. Saman was actually published when I was in Indonesia in 1998. It was really a very important moment for Indonesian history. And so, of course, I participated in this thing, and I remember also all the conversations, all the issues that were raised when Saman was published. Yeah. So the same also when I chose Tarian Bumi. Tarian Bumi actually describes an unconventional phase of Balinese culture, which I thought was interesting to give to the Italian public, who always think that Bali is only a paradise of beauty and of anything we can imagine. Pulang for me was very interesting because, of course, talks about important political political issues, plus talks a lot about food, which is something I'm interested in. And finally, Febi Indirani faces a very important topic, which is Islam in Indonesia, and is a very interesting idea of seeing Islam from a different perspective, which is actually what Febi Indirani wants to do with their short stories. So, you know, I choose based on these things. Now, if I say why you would like to translate Laut Bercerita, well, I was in Indonesia exactly in the time when the events of Laut Bercerita happened, about the activists that were abducted and so on. And I think, you know, I have a kind of sentimental link with these facts. I mean, it's really, when I read these pages, I just remember an important time of my life, which is 1998, 96, 98, when I was in Indonesia, when many important things were also happening in my own life. So it's really very, to me, it's really something very important that needs to be known to the Italian public. It might be biased, but I think everybody of us makes choices. So if I could make a choice, I would like to translate poems but I find that translating poems much more difficult than translating prose. So for the time being, I haven't really attempted any important project on translating poems.
So how do you come across these books and these new young writers? Do you have people in Indonesia that alert you to something new that's catching the interest of Indonesian readers and pass them on to you? Or this might be a question for all three of you. What do
if you want, I can
respond.
Yeah. Oh, I do
Question
go
for
to Indonesia. I do go to Indonesia at least twice a year, and I've got I'm still very much in touch with Indonesia. To me, Indonesia is my second home. So I probably, sometimes I know more about Indonesian literature and culture than what I know about my own culture. So I cannot really say what it is. Probably, yeah, it's by reading, it's by getting in touch with people, checking things on social media, getting, of course, exchanging ideas with friends who are in this field of literature. So in the case of Fabi, who is actually very young, I happen to hear about her publication. I was probably in Indonesia when there was a book launch, a small conversation. Then I was in touch with her, and through her, I've learned a number of other activities that she's been doing during this time. So when I decided to translate it, I just approached a very small independent publisher who was actually very, very excited about the idea of giving a collection of stories about a kind of parody of religion, of a parody of dogmatism in religion. So,
right.
So it's a mix.
Now to look at some of the complications, the challenges, the issues that you all face as a translator of Indonesian culture and of Indonesian language, of course, technical issues and cultural issues that you have to deal with page by page as you work as a translator. Sabine, what are some of the challenges that you have faced? Maybe with some stories of individual experiences you've had.
In general, maybe the first question I asked myself when I start a project, a translation project, the Indonesian author wrote the book for an Indonesian audience. And now to transfer the reading joy to a German speaking audience, I find this very difficult, but this is in general. So I wonder what is very familiar to an Indonesian reader and what is very exotic for the German reader, and what kind of atmosphere do I create or even reduce? For example, maybe Antonia knows it very well. It's Pulang by Leila Khudori. Yeah, in the beginning, Leila is picturing the situation on Jalan Sabang, yeah, in the middle of Jakarta, and this is not very exotic for the Indonesian reader, maybe, but it's very exotic for the German or European reader. And so I try to find a balance between it is a foreign country, it is a very exotic situation, it is very loud, there are some transportations which are unfamiliar, bemos, becak, and so with these little words, Leila creates an atmosphere, and I would like to, or I have to transfer into German for the German reader. And then I have to ask myself, what do I do with a bemo? Do I leave it as a bemo, or do I translate it into a public transportation mobile or something, or a becak? Do I still use a becak? To create or to support the exotic situation and atmosphere, or do I translate it into bicycle rickshaw, into German, which is meanwhile familiar word. So these are the questions I asked on every page. So what kind or to what extent can I support this exotic atmosphere, or do I have to reduce it because it is not the style of the.
What do you usually decide? How do you usually decide on this? What's your?
Maybe the main question is it style used by the author, or is it convention? So yeah, I think this is the main point.
And do you ever use footnotes to try and describe something that isn't known to the German readers, or do you try and avoid that on the whole?
I try to avoid it, and I just translated a book dealing with colonial history by Isaka Banu, and there we, the publisher and I decided to make a glossary at the end of the book to explain certain words which I used in the text. But I think this works because Isaka Banu writes about the historical past of Indonesia, the colonial past, which is also strange for German readers, but also for the Indonesian reader. And so I think this works quite well. So I try to find a balance between it.
And Harry, how do you approach these challenges for the translator of making Indonesian culture readily accessible to English readers who may or may not have a background in Indonesia?
It's a fine question, because if a work is exactly the same as something in English already, teenage romance in a big city, is it worth translating that? Is there something special that this book has to offer English readers that they can't find in other books? So on the one hand, I'm looking for something distinctive. I'm trying to avoid stereotype. So in translating politics, I don't want to present a picture of a suffering nation under a dictator, that someone like Pramudia is a hero and breaks free of that. And books about women, I don't want to stereotype Indonesian women as well. So the choice is very difficult. And with cultural objects, sometimes I gloss. One of the things I've found is that a lot of my translations are actually published in Southeast Asia, and I don't need to translate as much as I would for an audience in England or America. That's not who I'm publishing for in the end. And so if it's a bemo, I can say a bemo or a trisho, and people will understand. A durian, makan bubur. People will understand these things in Southeast Asia. And that was a hard learning, not in London, not in New York, but in Southeast Asia is where my readership is.
Yes, some of the hardest words I find to translate are things as basic as kampung and warung, and which may not be known to some people, but they're so familiar to all of us who spend time in Indonesia. Little
and
shop,
even harder,
cafe doesn't work for warung. Neither of them really work. And
even harder translating jokes.
Yeah.
Translating jokes is very difficult. Do you make up new jokes?
Yes.
Is it funny in Indonesian but not funny in English?
I remember in one of your poems, maybe I think it was Rendra, in your book on contemporary poetry, there was a reference to the shop of the Arabs, and you changed it to the shop of the Jews, because that would have a more significant resonance to English language readers. Do you remember that?
I remember
I taught
that.
those poems for years, Harry.
Thank you.
Okay, Antonia, what are the challenges that you find and have to overcome on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, the challenges are those that have already been mentioned. And how do I solve them? Of course, I'm talking to a public, the Italian public, who is not really acquainted to the Indonesian Indonesian culture as much as probably the the wider English world. So in my case, I cannot expect that people understand what bubur is or what necessarily what durian is, although durian has been mentioned in the 15th century first dictionary of Pigafetta, for instance, but for sure, probably only in the last 10 years, an Italian might have seen a durian, a real durian in a market. Now with these big markets and this attention to exotic food and spices, I think world, even in Italy, is opening up a bit. So I think we should distinguish with among situations where knowledge of the Indonesian world is much more known than in other places. In my case, the challenges are at every level. Of course, everybody has got the challenges in terms of translating from a language that has a particular kind of structure. We know that the structure of Indonesian is much different from the structure of our languages, flexive languages, for instance. So all the problems of tense, modes, terms of addresses, of course, I mean, all these issues that actually come out every time. In Italian, we don't have this very rich distinction of address terms, ba, pa, tanto, etc. So I have to find a way to address this. But also, I don't use footnotes simply because publishers don't like footnotes. So what I do is what probably all of you do, is just most of the time I use the term in italic, and then I try to paraphrase it in some way. And all my books, I think all of them have got a quite long glossary in the back, where actually I describe things. I try to avoid as much as possible, but when it's not possible, I cannot. I cannot help. I remember, for instance, Oka Rusmini. Oka Rusmini was using a lot of address terms in Balinese, even in his version of Indonesian. So I guess it was on purpose that he was doing that, and I thought that I should do the same as well when I translated in Italian, because if she used this kind of convention to address people in her environment, writing in Indonesian but using Balinese terms, I think I should have done the same when I did what I did in Italian. So sometimes I would use at the beginning meme, mama, for understanding that was ibu, mother, but then I would use the term for the rest of the term, just like a name, just like a name. So I would use these address terms as names. So talking about somebody, I would use these address terms. Of course, at the end of the book, then there was the glossary. The same with food in Lela Khudori. I mean, one of the most difficult things was food, the translation of food, which of course was it's a very important issue in culture, for the culture. And of course, also in this case, I would use the name in Indonesian and try in some way in the text to give some elements to understand what actually is about. It's done with the coconut milk, it's meat. Well, maybe I don't do the translation after the word, but I try to find a way to convey the meaning. The same also for instance, also in Oka Rusmini, there was lots of ethnographic kind of elements, rituals. I mean, how do you translate them? You try to, I try to describe them, but when it's not possible, then I just use the Indonesian or whatever. I mean, the same was the same for this translation that we've started attempting on Faisal Odang about the Toraja culture. Of course, I have to make decision and probably just use the term and try to give some explanation in the text.
It seems that's what most of us do, and there are ways around it. Now to the question, well, later, a couple more questions to all of you. How much interest is there in Indonesia and its literature in your countries? Who are the readers of the books that you translate? And how is Indonesian literature promoted generally in Italy, in Germany, in English-speaking countries, Australia, for example? Starting with you, Harry, in Australia.
In Australia, it's promoted at literary festivals, I guess, is the major concern, and touring Indonesian writers, reviewed a little bit in the newspapers and the cultural magazines. And I have to remember that translations as a whole are only 2% of everything that's published in English. So 2% is a very small amount, and people don't take a lot of notice of such a small bit. It's got to be really good. That's the way to promote it.
Yeah, well, we have a long 50-year tradition of having Indonesian taught in schools and universities here, but I don't know that that has meant that a lot of readers take up reading Indonesian literature once they have learnt about it in their courses. What's the situation in Germany, Sabine?
Yeah, in the course of the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2015, high hopes were placed here in Germany that Indonesian literature finally experiences a boom, and a lot of readers will buy Indonesian books, novels, short stories, and whatever. And of course, I personally thought there are so many interesting classic authors, young authors, such a diverse and vivid literary country, and I didn't have any doubts that Indonesian literature will boom in Germany. But then, after the Frankfurt Book Fair was over and the Guest of Honor program, only a few books were translated into German, and also publishers were not, didn't seem to be, they might be interested, but they didn't, I don't know, but they didn't get on fire for Indonesian literature, which is still strange for me. I usually compare it to Iceland. It's a very, very small country with only 350,000 inhabitants, and but the Icelandic literature here in Germany is booming, and I don't know what is, what can be done to promote Indonesian literature here in Germany more. So yeah.
And in Italy, Antonia?
Well, what is
literature
interesting?
becoming popular?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, no. Absolutely not. As I said, so far the publishers who have taken have decided to publish Indonesian literature are really very small indie publishers who actually make efforts to do. Well, I remember the very last book, the book by Fabi Indirani. Soon after the book was published, the publisher invited Fabi, who happened to be already in England because she was studying in London. So we found a way to invite her in Italy, and the publisher organized a tour of Italian towns where actually the book was discussed, and the book was actually on sale, well, sold, physically sold in the bookshops. Of course, after that, the book is not found anywhere, but thank God now we've got all this communication through social media, and you can buy books also online. So actually this thing helps a lot. But no, I mean, there's no way to promote Indonesian literature. I mean, who are the readers? Well, the readers are definitely all the students who study Indonesian literature in Naples. Whatever possibility we have to organize things, which we do in Italy. I mean, we sometimes occasionally do things about Southeast Asia. We have a small association, well, an association called the Italia Indonesia. I try to, to publish sometimes bits and pieces of ideas about things that have to do with Indonesia. But of course, I don't think it's our responsibility, only our responsibility. I mean, I'm a lecturer, I've got thousands of other things to do, and I cannot really use much more of my time into promoting Indonesia. I try to do it also through the Indonesian embassy. So sometimes when they organize events, I try to bring the issue that Indonesian literature is important. The Indonesian embassy was very happy to host Febin Dirani. They made a very nice event in the embassy, and we had a very full room where also the publisher sold lots of books. So I can see that some potential is there. The point is that there are so many bookshops and there are so many books produced every year in Italy, like anywhere. And of course, the possibility of competition is really very, very little. Publishers, big publishers, so far I've not been interested. Whenever I even sending ideas, what about you if we do this thing or this other, including Pramudi. I remember contacting Il Saggiatore, one of the publishers. They said, sorry, we have already bought the rights from an English version, and we are not going to do anything, because it was published the first two of the trilogy, and they weren't interested to do anything with the rest. So it's very difficult. I mean, I will keep doing what I'm doing. I hope to some of my students try to do something, but I understand that in my case, I have a job, I can survive. If I can tell my students, you survive with translation, we know very well that you cannot survive with translation of Indonesian literature in Italy, for sure. So yeah, well, and what is you were also questioning probably what is the response of the public about Indonesian literature. Generally is very positive. I remember when we did this the book of Febin Dirani about idea of light Islam in Indonesia. It was really very well met by the public in Italy, but also by my colleagues, because I involved two colleagues, one expert on gender issues in the Islamic world, and a colleague of Arabic literature. And they were absolutely happy to hear there's a literature of an Islamic country that is able to can be so brave, so interesting. And so, of course, was kind a kind of success. And the publisher was very good also into finding places where, inviting Fabi to do interviews. As I said, it should be actually an effort from different stakeholders. I mean, it cannot just be the fact that you translate a book and the book goes in the market. I also, as Sabine said, had big hopes from Frankfurt Book Fair. Of course, Frankfurt is Frankfurt, but I really had hoped that something might change. And as a matter of fact, very little has changed. At least, I mean, this publisher actually, the one who published Febin Dirani, was actually to the Frankfurt Book Fair, but still, I think there's lots, much, a lot to do.
Thank you. Yeah, the question chat box is filling up, but I quickly want to hear from you, just briefly, each of you, how you personally go about the translation process, often to meet a deadline, perhaps, or and do you work closely with the Indonesian writer, or do you prefer to work alone? Just quickly, Harry, how do you go about it?
I do a rough draft, then I look at the problems in the rough draft: gender, time, place, cultural items. I do a better draft in my English, I look at the rhythm, I look at the tone, I look at the level of the writing. Then I do what I call a final draft, which is never final. I type 3 times, 10 times, run it through my head, listen to it time and time again. And it's never finished.
Yeah, sometimes reading bits aloud makes it sound good in English or stiff in English, and therefore you might need to
You get a sense
read.
of it, yeah, how natural
yes.
it is.
And Sabina, how do you go about it?
Yeah, reading out loud is it's very important for me too. And usually, so far, I was very lucky that the authors I translated are still alive, luckily, and they were very helpful. I have to say, I usually try to contact them and ask many, many questions. And for the last project, for example, I used to make a table with my questions, and the author could answer it in the other form. That was quite, that was quite good to handle, and I thought it was a good way. And I don't hesitate to annoy the author and ask many, many questions.
And Antonia, briefly from you.
Yeah, well, I also basically follow the same way, although I work a lot with my students. So I use my students as my people who actually with whom I discuss. What would you say in Italian that is probably more interesting, more creative, more, we should be able to say this or that. So I actually do work with my students a lot, although they probably don't have a big competence, but they're speakers of Italian. They are the future readers of possible readers of my books. So I always do this with them. And of course, I get in touch with authors. I should say sometimes when I asked authors, they said, sorry, I don't remember. It was a long time ago. So not necessarily the authors can give an answer. I remember one of the short stories of Fabi. Fabi has a short story called Babi Ingin Masuk Islam. So it's about a pig who wants to become a Muslim. And of course, in Italy, she is playing on the fact that this person is called Babi, but also baby, and she uses Y at the end. So it's this way of playing with words. Of course, in Italian, I wouldn't be able to do that. So I just used another word, Maya, because maialina, maiale is the word. So you have to have a bit of creativity. And for this, actually, I did consult with her, with Fabi. And Fabi said, oh, whatever, if you like it, it's nice. It's nice that my Babi Ingin Masuk Islam becomes Maya wants to become a Muslim. So, well, it's, of course, I mean, there are several levels and possibilities.
Right.
And reading aloud is very important, yeah.
Yeah. My final process is to send the whole thing to a friend to read who doesn't know a word of Indonesian and is not necessarily really very familiar with every cultural aspect of Indonesia, and to get back from her any suggested changes. Right, the question box is full. One we talked about this morning when we had a chat, and we're not sure if we would have time to discuss, but John McGlynn wants to know, are most translators products of the universities where Indonesian is taught, and what is the state of Indonesian studies in your countries, and are there threats to its continued existence, the teaching of Indonesian, which of course there is in Australia. It's been going downhill for some time now. Harry, do you want to address that at all?
Don't want to address the going downhill. I'm interested in the fact that many translators are university graduates, people who are curious and creative and intelligent about works of literature. There's a very great difference between translating works of literature with a capital L and translating pop literature as well. And different people have different backgrounds, different interests. Okay, next person.
So are Indonesian studies thriving in Italy and Germany in your single universities there?
Well, if I can answer, what is the state? Well, Indonesian studies have been very, I haven't really seen a decrease in number of students interested. I mean, I would say actually there is a slight increase in numbers, but it's because we teach Indonesian in a department of Asian studies, and generally Indonesian is associated to another Asian language, and I would say there is a kind of stable interest. The point is that in Italy, my university is the only one that offers Indonesian studies. So it's probably, it would be actually good if some other universities would open up new courses of Indonesian, but I don't really see, I haven't seen any, you know, any door open about this. I know that in Venice, for instance, they've opened a department of Southeast Asian studies, but they are really very much working on Vietnamese and Thai. They've never really expressed an interest to open up to Indonesian, but you know, it might be that in the future they can start doing it. In Italy, in Napoli, I don't think there's any threat about this. Many students have graduated, many of them are very good. Some people have taken their PhD. I mean, we are really very small in comparison to, well, Australia, also in Germany. I mean, we can count the persons in Italy who are involved in this, but I'm not worried about the state of the art of Indonesian language and literature in Italy.
So there's quite a challenging question here from Zen Hai from Lontar. He asks, because every translation is a betrayal, what kind of betrayal have you ever made on Indonesian literary works, especially in translating poetry? So maybe Harry and Sabina can share their experience.
I don't think it's a betrayal. I think it's a liberation, a freedom, and a chance to escape. like this bird escaping from the orange sea into the sky. No, I don't confess to my sins. I think they're creative. Lines from Gunawan Muhammad. Lewat kunang, ku lupakan wajahmu, kau lupakan wajahku. And lupa goes with kenang, to remember. And so he's talking about remembering and forgetting and fireflies. But I use the word ember, and that's a betrayal. But ember goes with remember, goes with forgetting. So there are little things that one does.
That's poetry.
But it's poetry. Of course, you can do that sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. And another question that probably goes with that, do you ever seek to approach a living author for his response to your translations, or to get general context or specific problems from him, her? Sabina?
Sabina, yeah.
Yeah, so if I understood the question right, is it that the discussion between the author and me, if there are any controversials, or I just didn't get the question right?
Yeah. Do you approach the author, or do you let the author still read your works?
None of the authors so far was able to read German. So, but if I have a difficult page or difficult sentences, or a difficult part of the translation, I used to discuss it with him or her, and I would like to explain how I translated it and what difficulties I had and what solutions I found. And for example, as Antonia mentioned before, the addressing of people, is it, and again the question, is it style or convention? Do I have to use the address forms, Balinese for example, in an Indonesian version, or can I find another solution. So that's, I like to discuss it with him or her.
It's more likely with an Indonesian author who speaks English, more likely to speak English than German, perhaps, that we can approach our authors.
There's some authors are good to work with. Some are very bad, that they criticize you and abuse you, and their English is not as good as your English, but they're very insistent you should do it their way, whether it's the right way or not.
Some appear to be uncontactable too,
Yeah.
I found.
Can I say something about betrayal? Can I just say something about betrayal?
Antonia, sorry.
Well, I don't think, I believe that translating is betraying, but I think as also Harry said, is liberating. And I would say, it's very important, I think, it's our way to become ourselves authors and poets. It's my way to express myself as an author that I will never become, if I can talk about myself. So really, it's a very, very rewarding experience that allows to be you as a translator, to be an author that you will never become. So more than betraying, is liberating and giving you many chances.
Last question.
Right. Somebody has asked a question which I don't know if we can answer. That is there a database where you can find out what has been translated across all languages and how to access that information? But that's something that Lontar probably knows.
Yeah, no, there is a database. It's not very good. It's run by UNESCO and is called the Index Translationum, Index of Translations. It's not up to date at all, but it exists, and it exists for most languages. So you can.
And publishers send their information to this database, do they?
Most of them do.
Yeah.
Some of them don't, but it's there.
And Sabina, a question that said that you said that it's sometimes necessary for a translator to arrange funding for publication. What organizations are providing funding for translations in Germany?
As for Germany, there is one organization that funds especially translation from of books from Asian, African, and South Latin countries. So publishers can apply for a funding there. So this is quite interesting for Indonesian literature. And then there are some scholarships from the DVU, that's the German translators funding program. So there are different scholarships, and you can apply for a funding. But there's not much really.
Right, there are a lot of other questions, but it seems that the time is now 9 o'clock, and I assume we, to bring this session to a close. It's been quite illuminating to hear, especially from our colleagues in Germany and Italy, the situations that you face. We're much more familiar with our own situation, of course, here in Australia, where there are a lot of us working in the field. But thank you so much to all of you. And it's been a real pleasure to hear you tonight. And I look forward to looking at this session again on YouTube when Lontar puts it up there. And hopefully we'll be able to keep in touch. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you. Yeah, bye. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.